Hello everyone, and welcome back to Legacy of Rich Dynasties, where history's wealth, power, and ambition come alive through the stories of the families who built, ruled, and sometimes lost it all. I'm glad to have you here today. How are you doing? Wherever you're watching from, take a deep breath, settle in, and let's travel back to the dawn of the industrial age when a single invention transformed not just a nation, but the very rhythm of the modern world. Today, we explore the Ford family, a dynasty that turned machinery into movement, ideas into empires, and progress into both triumph and tragedy. This is the story of Henry Ford, the man who built the machine that changed the world, and the family that paid the price for his vision. Now, let's begin. Detroit, Michigan. Morning light slips through oil-dusted windows at the Highland Park plant, glinting off rails and rivets as a moving line hums to life. Frames arrive as skeletons and depart as automobiles, carried along by a rhythm so precise it feels like a metronome beating for an entire nation. Men in blue work coats stand shoulder to shoulder, each entrusted with a single gesture repeated until the gesture becomes muscle memory. Until muscle memory becomes the law. In the center of this choreography, a lean man with inquisitive eyes and a stopwatch studies every motion, every pause, every needless step. Henry Ford is not merely building cars, he is arranging time. He believes time is the most precious raw material and that the world can be improved by stripping waste from human effort. The moving assembly line that settles into perfection in the early 19-teens turns chaos into cadence. What was once craft becomes flow. Components glide to the worker. The worker does not chase the component. Prices fall as if obedient to a new gravity. And America discovers a strange, liberating truth. Mobility can be mass-produced. A black-painted car that ordinary people can afford rolls into driveways that had only ever known dust and hoofprints, and weekend roads begin to fill with maps of desire. Henry Ford does not just sell machines. He sells the promise of going farther than your father did. Yet every miracle charges a fee. Repetition taxes the hands and dulls the spirit. Wages climb, and with them expectations of punctuality, sobriety, domestic tidiness, even the shape of a man's leisure. Company investigators from a so-called sociological department appear on doorsteps to measure virtue like they would measure a camshaft, insisting that better pay requires better living. Efficiency becomes both a ladder and a leash. Inside the plant, the rhythm is relentless. Outside, the rhythm follows, knocking on the walls of the worker's private life, asking if he conforms to the beat. The man at the center is certain of his benevolence. He sees waste as a kind of moral sin, and order as a gift to the many. He has little patience for complexity or compromise, less patience for bankers and experts, and almost no patience for disobedience. Newspapers call him a wizard of industry. Foreign visitors arrive to witness a factory that seems to outrun the clock. Even presidents admire the alchemy by which high wages meet low prices, a marriage that remakes the bargain between labor and capital and turns a nation of pedestrians into a nation on wheels. But power, once earned, begins to harden. Distrust of unions becomes doctrine. A private army of loyal enforcers shadows the gates. A personal newspaper amplifies opinions that should have remained private and, in spreading them, stains a reputation that once gleamed like polished steel. Praise persists. But so do protests, and the legend that set America in motion begins to drag a lengthening shadow behind it. At Fair Lane, the house by the Rouge River, the triumph of the factory coexists with a quieter trouble. Edsel Ford, the only son, moves through rooms lined with art and sketches, a thoughtful young man drawn to design, proportion, the curve of a fender that pleases the eye as much as the road. He believes the future will not only be faster, it will be finer. His father, a farmer engineer at heart, trusts sturdiness and standardization more than elegance. Where the father prizes control, the son prizes refinement. Where the father hears the hammer's beat, the son hears music. Between them stands a company that belongs to both and to neither, a dynasty built on motion that cannot easily change direction. The city outside reflects the family drama within. Detroit swells with new arrivals, neighborhoods bloom and harden, and assembly line logic seeps into everything from apartment schedules to church socials. The car rearranges the American week, the American courtship, the American dream of a home beyond walking distance. It democratizes freedom while centralizing power, a paradox with wheels. The world learns a new cadence: quicker work, cheaper goods, longer roads, farther horizons. And hidden in the cadence is a question as sharp as a freshly milled gear. Does the line serve the man, or must the man submit to the line? Henry Ford once brushed off the weight of the past with a shrug, treating history like a dusty ledger that only slows the forward march. Yet the past does not vanish. It compiles. Every factory rule, every editorial, every managerial command stacks into a record that will judge as surely as any court. The genius who taught metal to move taught men to move as well, and now must face what happens when movement outruns mercy. Stand for a moment on the floor of Highland Park and listen. The sound is not only steel and steam, it is the certainty of a single mind applied to a million gestures. It is the hum of a country discovering speed and the ache of workers discovering sameness. It is the proud silence of a son swallowing disagreement and the louder silence of a father who cannot imagine being wrong. It is America learning how to go and a family learning how hard it is to stop. The first spark of this story does not appear in a laboratory, but on a small farm in Dearborn, where a boy took apart watches to understand why they ran and then, in time, devoted his life to making everything run. That boy became the man who organized a century. The cost of that organization paid in dignity, in trust, in the fragile space between a father and a son will unfold like a long road after dusk. And somewhere up that road lies a truth no machine can simplify. The power to move the world means little if you cannot move the heart that guides it. From this beginning, steel bright, engines warm, a nation ready, the trail bends back toward the soil of Dearborn, to the family roots that shaped a restless mind and a complicated air. Long before the clang of metal and the rhythm of assembly lines, there was the quiet of farmland, the patient sound of wind moving across the flat fields of Michigan. Henry Ford was born there, in the summer of 1863, on a modest farm outside Dearborn. His father, William Ford, was an Irish immigrant who believed in the dignity of manual work. His mother, Mary Lydigot Ford, offered warmth and imagination in a household ruled by duty. The family's world was simple: sunrise over wheat, horses pulling plows, tools repaired rather than replaced. Yet, even as a child, Henry felt restless among the rows of crops. He admired the steady rhythm of machinery far more than the irregular pulse of seasons. At 12, he dismantled a pocket watch given to him by his father, not out of mischief, but curiosity. When he managed to reassemble it and make it tick again, neighbors began bringing him their broken timepieces. Soon, the boy from Dearborn became known as a local watch fixer. It was the first hint of a lifelong obsession, understanding how things work and how they might work better. Years later, he would recall that farm not with nostalgia, but as a place of confinement, a good place to be from, not to stay in. The America that raised Henry Ford was one of transition. Railroads cut across prairies, telegraphs strung thoughts between cities, steamships carried immigrants westward in search of opportunity. The Civil War had ended less than a generation earlier, leaving a country determined to rebuild through invention. The frontier was closing, but the industrial frontier was opening. Men like Thomas Edison became folk heroes, self-made minds, who bent science to the will of progress. Henry Ford, barely in his teens, read about these men and decided he would join their ranks, not as a dreamer, but as a mechanic of destiny. He left the farm in his late teens, walking to Detroit with little more than ambition and the confidence of one who could repair almost anything. His first jobs were in machine shops, dark, loud places where the smell of oil hung heavy and the hours were long. There, he learned the language of metal, how gears kissed, how pistons breathed, how precision separated a tool from a toy. It was not wealth that fascinated him, but motion, the conversion of energy into purpose. In 1888, Ford married Clara Bryant, the daughter of a neighboring farmer. Clara possessed the steady patience that Henry lacked. She believed in his visions even when others dismissed them as mechanical fantasies. When the young couple moved to Detroit, they carried only what they could fit in a wagon. Henry took a job as an engineer for the Edison Illuminating Company, a position that would alter his life. Working with electricity during its infancy, he met Thomas Edison himself, whose blend of audacity and practicality confirmed Henry's belief that one man could reshape civilization. Late at night, after shifts at the power plant, Henry tinkered in a shed behind their home, building what he called a quadricycle, a gasoline-powered carriage that rattled and sputtered down the streets of Detroit in the spring of 1896. Neighbors watched in disbelief as the contraption rolled past horse-drawn wagons. To them, it was noise. To him, it was prophecy. That ride marked the birth of a conviction that the future would belong to those who could put the world on wheels. Clara endured the long nights, the failures, the debts. She wrote in a letter that her husband cannot rest while any machine still resists him. Their first and only child, Edsel, was born in 1893, a gentle boy with his mother's quiet temperament. As Henry labored to conquer mechanics, Edsel grew under Clara's care, sketching, reading, finding joy in art rather than iron. The bond between father and son would later be tested by the very thing that defined Henry's genius, his need to control. The turn of the century was merciless to inventors. Ford's early attempts at founding companies ended quickly. The Detroit Automobile Company, his first venture, collapsed after only a year. Investors grew impatient with his perfectionism. He refused to release a car that did not meet his evolving standards, and by the time he did, the firm was already broke. Yet failure did not weaken him, it refined him. He often said that every mistake is simply an opportunity to begin again, this time more intelligently. The lesson came at a price. To survive, Ford took a humbler job repairing steam engines, learning efficiency not from textbooks but from necessity. He studied the flow of work, how time could be compressed, how repetition could become an ally instead of a burden. When he finally gathered new backers and launched the Ford Motor Company in the early 1900s, he carried not only technical expertise, but a philosophy forged by hardship: simplify, standardize, and never waste motion. That creed had roots in his childhood. On the farm, he had watched his father struggle against weather, chance, and inefficiency. Machines, by contrast, obeyed. They answered to design, not to fate. If a plow broke, it could be mended. If an engine failed, it could be rebuilt. To Ford, machines represented justice, predictable, impartial, immune to weakness. This belief would later shape not only his factories, but his moral outlook. He would try to engineer society itself with the same precision, and in doing so, blur the line between order and control. Back in Dearborn, the Ford family became symbols of modern aspiration. Relatives who once doubted the wandering mechanic now saw his name in newspapers. Clara managed the household as fame crept in, and Edsel, still a child, began visiting the workshops, fascinated by his father's miniature models and by the smell of grease and metal. Henry encouraged curiosity, but discouraged hesitation. In his eyes, hesitation was the first symptom of failure. Friends recalled that when he spoke of the future, Ford's tone carried both excitement and impatience, as if destiny itself were lagging behind his vision. He dreamed of a car sturdy enough for farmers, cheap enough for clerks, and simple enough for anyone to drive. The idea was not just mechanical, it was democratic. He wanted mobility to erase class distinctions, to grant every man the same horizon. Yet embedded in that dream was a paradox, a belief in equality born from a mind obsessed with uniformity. By the dawn of the new century, America's cities were swelling, its roads expanding, its factories multiplying. In this world of endless invention, Henry Ford stood at the threshold between the old and the new, a farmer's son armed with machinery and faith. Behind him lay the patient fields of Dearborn. Ahead, a roaring century of speed. And somewhere in that transition between the farm and the factory, between the watchmaker and the world-maker, a dynasty began to take shape. When Henry Ford founded the Ford Motor Company in the summer of 1903, few imagined that this modest enterprise, just a handful of investors and a rented workshop, would soon rewrite the rules of the modern world. At the time, automobiles were toys of the wealthy, fragile, expensive, handcrafted machines that required chauffeurs and constant repair. Ford's dream was heresy. He wanted a car that any man could own, maintain, and drive himself. He believed mobility should not be a privilege. It should be a right of the working class. The early models were small triumphs, but imperfect, each more affordable than the last, each testing the patience of financiers who measured progress by quarterly returns. Henry measured it by utility. "I will build a motor car for the great multitude," he declared. "Constructed of the best materials, simple in operation, so low in price that no man making a good salary will be unable to own one. The statement was less a promise than a prophecy. By 1908, that prophecy had a name, the Model T. It was rugged, reliable, and, above all, simple. Its engine could be repaired with a wrench and wire. It handled muddy roads as easily as city streets. Painted black for speed of production and durability, the car became an icon before advertising had to try. Families named them Tin Lizzies, farmers used them as tractors, and ministers used them as hearses. The car transcended purpose. It became part of the American vocabulary. Success arrived not as an avalanche, but as a tide. Orders outstripped production, and Ford realized that even innovation must evolve. The bottleneck was not invention, it was time. In the vast plant at Highland Park, he and a team of engineers, led by Charles Sorensen and Walter Flanders, began studying the motion of work itself. They dismantled the old process and rebuilt it as a sequence, each task stripped to its essence, each man responsible for one small perfection. Out of this experiment emerged the moving assembly line of 1913, a spectacle of precision and purpose that would become the heartbeat of the 20th century. The change was staggering. A car that once required 12 hours to build could now be completed in less than 2. Costs plunged, wages rose. In 1914, Ford stunned the world by announcing the $5 day, a wage twice the industry standard. Newspapers called it a social revolution. Thousands flooded Detroit seeking employment. Critics accused him of naivete. Competitors accused him of madness. Yet behind the gesture lay cold logic. Higher pay meant lower turnover, higher productivity, and a loyal workforce that could afford to buy the very product they made. Henry Ford had discovered a self-sustaining cycle, mass production and mass consumption, feeding one another in perpetual motion. By the late 19-teens, Ford Motor Company was not merely a manufacturer. It was a civilization unto itself. The River Rouge complex, stretching mile after mile along the water, became the largest integrated factory on Earth, where raw ore entered one end and finished automobiles rolled out the other. Smoke rose like banners. Train lines converged as if paying tribute. Foreign visitors walked through the gates and whispered that America had found its cathedral. To millions, Henry Ford embodied the nation's promise. He was the farm boy who had out-engineered the aristocracy of industry, the man who gave power to the people, the Democrat of machines. Presidents consulted him. Newspapers praised him. Poets wrote odes to his pragmatism. The Model T sold by the millions, transforming not only travel, but life itself. Towns spread outward. Motels and gas stations blossomed along the highways, and Sunday drives replaced Sunday walks. The rhythm of existence quickened. The world felt smaller, faster, more possible. Yet for all the adoration, Ford remained curiously apart from the glamour of his success. He preferred plain suits, disliked Wall Street, distrusted bankers, and believed speculation was a moral disease. "If you think of standardization as the best you know today," he once said, "but which is to be improved tomorrow, you get somewhere." To him, progress was not profit, it was purification. Inside the company, his authority was absolute. The Ford family name appeared everywhere, on plants, on paychecks, on the hopes of entire towns. Clara Ford, serene and dignified, managed the growing household and shielded their son Edsel from the harshest edges of his father's discipline. But even as a young man, Edsel could sense the contradiction that defined Henry. The desire to liberate mankind through mobility while keeping everything under his personal control. Edsel joined the company in the 19-teens, bringing with him an instinct for aesthetics that his father neither shared nor trusted. He admired European design, sleek lines, and the refinement of craft that went beyond utility. He believed the company's future required not only engineering genius, but artistic grace. His father, however, saw beauty as distraction. "Any color," Henry quipped, "so long as it's black." That line, repeated endlessly, became both slogan and symbol, the efficiency of uniformity, elevated to faith. The years of the Great War deepened Ford's complexity. Though a patriot, he despised conflict and attempted to sponsor a peace ship to Europe in 1915, a naive voyage that ended in ridicule. His moralism sometimes blurred into arrogance. He believed he could engineer diplomacy as easily as machinery. Yet, on the factory floor, his methods seemed infallible. Profits soared. The Model T conquered continents. By the mid-20s, half the cars in the world bore his name. Detroit itself transformed into a monument to motion. Streets thrummed with the echo of engines. Suburbs expanded in concentric circles like ripples from a stone dropped into a still pond. The automobile was no longer luxury, it was identity. Freedom was measured in miles per gallon, and Ford stood at the center of this new creed. In those golden years, photographs captured him smiling beside presidents and pioneers. But the smile was thin, reserved. Behind it lay fatigue, suspicion, and a sense that the empire he had built might someday outgrow his grip. He viewed labor unions as conspiracies, modern art as decadence, and high finance as parasitic. The world was changing around him: radio, jazz, cinema, electric lights, and he often seemed caught between admiration and resentment. Edsel Ford, now in his 30s, became president of the company in name but not in power. He modernized design, supported innovation like the Lincoln luxury line, and cultivated a humane culture that contrasted sharply with his father's rigidity. Employees admired him, artists sought him, and his mother cherished him. Yet every decision he made required his father's approval. Letters between executives reveal a pattern of interference: Henry overturning orders, rescinding contracts, and humbling his son in front of subordinates. The genius who had revolutionized industry could not trust his own blood to steer its future. Still, the dynasty expanded. The Fords became America's first family of industry. They built schools, hospitals, and foundations. They donated to research and sponsored rural electrification. In public, they represented benevolence. In private, tension simmered. The car that symbolized freedom had become a cage of expectation. The Roaring Twenties amplified both triumph and trouble. The Model T, once revolutionary, began to look dated beside General Motors' colorful, stylish cars. Henry resisted change, convinced that practicality would always triumph over fashion. Edsel pleaded for modernization, warning that the company's dominance could not last forever. Ford's refusal to adapt would cost him dearly, but not yet. For the moment, his empire still glistened, a city of engines bathed in light. On his 63rd birthday, Ford stood before thousands of workers as they cheered his name. Factories paused production. Newspapers hailed him as the man who put the world on wheels. Yet even amid celebration, he appeared distracted, glancing toward the horizon, as if already searching for an enemy unseen. That enemy, it turned out, was time itself, the same force he once claimed to master. Under the blaze of prosperity, darker elements began to stir. The Dearborn Independent, his personal newspaper, started publishing controversial editorials that reflected his mistrust of certain groups and ideas. These writings would soon draw outrage across the nation, foreshadowing the moral contradictions that would haunt his legacy. For now, though, the machine roared on. The plant whistles marked every hour, the roads stretched farther, and the American dream rolled smoothly on 4 black wheels. Henry Ford had achieved what monarchs and ministers never could. He had reorganized life itself around motion, rhythm, and steel. But progress, once set in motion, does not wait for its maker. It moves ahead, tireless, indifferent, and sometimes it crushes what cannot keep pace. In the shadow of triumph, conflict was already gathering its shape. Success, like machinery, has a hum. At first, it is steady and reassuring, but if you listen long enough, you can hear when it begins to grind. For Henry Ford, that grinding sound began in the early 1920s when triumph gave way to obsession. The world hailed him as a genius, yet he increasingly saw the world as a place that needed discipline rather than admiration. His faith in order hardened into dogma. Inside the Ford Motor Company, every rule, every wage, every decision passed through him alone. He had built the perfect system. Now he sought to perfect the men inside it. The sociological department, which once existed to help workers live respectably, grew into a quiet police force of morality. Inspectors appeared unannounced at homes, questioning wives about cleanliness, savings, and sobriety. Those who failed the tests lost their bonuses, sometimes their jobs. Ford claimed it was benevolence to help men help themselves. But to others, it was surveillance dressed as virtue. The factory floor, once a symbol of opportunity, began to feel like a vast classroom run by a single teacher who could not bear to be questioned. As America roared into the Jazz Age, Ford recoiled. He disliked alcohol, modern music, Wall Street speculation, and most of all, unions. To him, collective bargaining was chaos, the one thing his assembly lines could not tolerate. He hired a former prizefighter named Harry Bennett to manage labor relations, though manage meant control by intimidation. Bennett built a private militia of enforcers known as the Service Department. They patrolled the plants, broke strikes, and ensured that no worker forgot whose empire this was. At the same time, Ford turned his attention to ideas beyond machinery and into a darker realm. Through his personal newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, he began publishing a series of articles blaming the world's ills on Jewish financiers and international conspiracies. The pieces, later compiled into a volume called The International Jew, spread virulently across the country and even beyond its borders. Historians would later describe it as one of the most influential anti-Semitic publications of the century. The public reaction was fierce. Jewish organizations denounced him. Intellectuals condemned him. Yet Ford, insulated by success and flattery, dismissed criticism as misunderstanding. In 1927, after years of pressure and lawsuits, he finally issued a public apology, ghostwritten and strategic, not heartfelt. Still, the damage was done. The man once celebrated as America's kindest industrialist now carried a stain that no amount of polish could remove. At home, the shadow lengthened. Edsel Ford, by then in his 30s, tried to modernize the company and repair its image. He loved his father, yet feared him. Sensitive, imaginative, Edsel represented everything Henry distrusted: refinement, diplomacy, vulnerability. While Henry saw the world in mechanical absolutes, right or wrong, efficient or wasteful, Edsel understood its shades. His vision for the brand included elegance and innovation, such as the development of the Lincoln luxury line, the V-type engine, and artistic automobile design. These projects often thrived only because Edsel pursued them quietly, away from his father's interference. But Henry always found out. He undermined Edsel's authority before subordinates, rescinded decisions without explanation, and occasionally humiliated him during board meetings. Employees learned to read the air. When Henry entered the room, silence followed. He was the kind of man, one executive recalled, who could make you feel wrong even when you were right. The emotional toll on Edsel deepened as the years passed. He suffered chronic stomach pain, exhaustion, and insomnia symptoms that doctors later linked to stress and ulcers. His wife, Eleanor Clay Ford, a woman of grace and strength, became his anchor. She encouraged him to continue, to hold the company steady as it navigated the Depression and looming war. During the Great Depression, Ford's paternalism took an even harsher turn. While he refused to cut wages outright, he laid off thousands when demand collapsed. Riots erupted outside the River Rouge plant in 1932, culminating in what newspapers called the Ford Hunger March. Police and Ford guards opened fire on protesters, killing several men and wounding dozens. The image of Ford, once the benefactor of the working class, darkened irreversibly. His name, once synonymous with fairness, now carried echoes of tyranny. Edsel, horrified by the violence, pleaded for reform. He argued that compassion was not weakness, that listening to labor would strengthen the company, not destroy it. But Henry, unyielding, saw dissent as betrayal. "They have my name," he said, "and they will do things my way." In private, Edsel retreated into art, collecting paintings and supporting architecture. He collaborated with designers who sought to bring beauty into the machine age. He financed the Detroit Institute of Arts and cultivated friendships with artists who saw industry not as menace but as muse. Through his quiet patronage, the softer side of the Ford legacy took shape, one measured not in profit but in culture. Yet it was a legacy overshadowed by his father's iron hand. The approach of the Second World War magnified their differences. Ford, now in his late 70s, opposed American entry into the conflict and resisted government contracts for military production. He insisted that war was waste, another failure of efficiency. Edsel, more pragmatic, recognized the necessity of rearmament and the opportunity for the company to contribute to national defense. He led efforts to produce B-24 Liberator bombers at the Willow Run plant, one of the largest manufacturing feats in history. The strain between father and son reached its breaking point. Henry publicly questioned Edsel's leadership, at times refusing to sign official documents necessary for production. Witnesses describe meetings in which Edsall's hands trembled while Henry glared in silence. In the press, Ford Motor Company appeared united, but inside its offices, the dynasty was fracturing. Amid this turmoil, Edsall's health collapsed. Years of tension, the burden of expectation, and the ceaseless fight for autonomy took their toll. In the spring of 1943, Edsall Ford died of stomach cancer at only 49 years old. The news stunned the nation. To his employees, he had been a gentle leader, a man who smiled often, who cared. To his father, he was the son who never understood that control, not compassion, kept the wheels turning. Henry Ford, at 80, stood over the casket in silence. The man who had conquered time found himself powerless before it. Those present said he did not weep. He simply stared, as though calculating what part had broken. He had lost his air, his counterbalance, and his conscience. After Edsall's death, Ford tried to resume control of the company, but the world had changed. The government viewed him as erratic, his decisions unpredictable. Factories faltered, executives resigned, and production lagged. Harry Bennett gained influence, ruling through fear while Ford retreated into the isolation of Fair Lane. Clara, heartbroken, withdrew from public life, mourning both her son and the husband she no longer recognized. Even Henry's own employees began to question the myth. Was he still the visionary of Highland Park, or had success corroded the clarity that once defined him? A journalist visiting him in the mid-40s described a man trapped inside his own invention, still running, but going nowhere. His newspaper empire had long since collapsed. His reputation abroad, tainted by earlier sympathies with nationalist regimes, never recovered. Yet in Dearborn, the machinery still moved. The plants kept building under the inertia of habit. The name still sold cars, and the dynasty endured even as its patriarch faded behind the sound of the engines. History often flatters its builders, but with Henry Ford, admiration came with discomfort. He democratized mobility, yes, but he also industrialized control. He gave the working man a wage, and then measured his virtue. He built an empire of motion, but demanded obedient stillness beneath it. By the final years of the war, whispers began about succession. There was only one logical choice: Henry Ford II, Edsall's eldest son, young, ambitious, and educated in a modern world his grandfather barely understood. The board knew change was coming. So did Clara, who quietly urged the transfer of power before the company collapsed entirely. In 1945, under immense pressure from the U.S. government and his own family, Henry Ford stepped down as president of the Ford Motor Company. His grandson took the helm, inheriting not just an enterprise, but a contradiction, a legacy of brilliance entangled with moral blindness. For the first time in decades, the assembly lines paused to honor the transition. Workers bowed their heads. Some prayed, some remembered the old man's generosity, others his tyranny. Few realized they were witnessing the twilight of an era, the passing of the industrial monarch who had both built and broken them. As for Henry Ford, he returned to Fair Lane, surrounded by memories and ghosts of motion. The machine still roared in the distance, but he seldom visited. Visitors described him as gentle yet detached, his once sharp gaze softened by age. He spent his days walking the gardens with Clara, speaking little, listening to the wind as if it were the echo of the assembly line. He had conquered the world with order, but order, he finally discovered, cannot console. And in that silence, the empire he built began to tremble, waiting for a new generation to rebuild what ambition had undone. The year was 1943, when the lights dimmed in Dearborn. The death of Edsall Ford did not only end a life, it unbalanced a universe. Inside the great empire of steel and glass, whispers replaced confidence, and the hum of machines seemed less triumphant, more mechanical, as if the rhythm itself sensed that its creator had grown old and uncertain. Henry Ford, now past 80, tried to return to the office as if time could be commanded like a tool, but age had stolen the precision from his judgment. His mind, once sharper than any gear, began to skip and stall. Decisions came slowly, inconsistently. One day he approved a plan. The next, he reversed it without reason. Executives who had served him for decades watched with quiet dread. The company's financial stability faltered, and for the first time, Ford Motor risked losing control of the market it had once created. The government noticed. The war effort required absolute reliability from industry, and Ford's unpredictability worried Washington. Army officials feared that a company producing bombers at Willow Run could collapse under the erratic command of an aging patriarch. In private correspondence, the War Production Board described the situation as a national liability wearing the mask of a national legend. Clara Ford, still grieving her son, intervened. She could see what her husband could not: that the dynasty was at risk of self-destruction. In her quiet way, she began rallying the board, urging that leadership be passed to her grandson Henry Ford II, then in his late 20s, serving in the Navy. The move would save not only the company but the family name. By 1945, the transition was complete. Under immense pressure from the U.S. government, the banks, and his own family, Henry Ford stepped down as president. The newspapers reported the change politely, but behind the decorum was a sigh of relief that rippled through Detroit. The young Ford, known simply as the Deuce, returned from service to find an empire in disarray. Outdated models, chaotic accounting, demoralized executives, and an aging founder still unwilling to let go. The new Henry was different. Educated at Yale, pragmatic and charismatic, he belonged to a new generation shaped by war, not by the frontier. He respected his grandfather, but did not revere him. Within months, he began modernizing every department, hiring outsiders, and dismantling the inner circle of enforcers who had ruled through fear. Harry Bennett, the notorious head of the service department, was forced out a symbolic exorcism of his grandfather's iron shadow. For the first time, the Ford Motor Company became professional rather than paternal. Accountants replaced loyalists, engineers replaced overseers. The culture of control gave way to collaboration. Ford II surrounded himself with what journalists later called the whiz kids, a group of young veterans from the Army Air Forces who applied statistical logic and management science to business. Among them was Robert McNamara, who would one day become Secretary of Defense. Together, they transformed the Ford empire into a modern corporation, rescuing it from the relic of its founder's will. While the company entered a new era, the old Henry Ford retreated into the stillness of Fair Lane. His daily walks grew slower. His memory faltered. Once obsessed with motion, he now moved like a man who had finally met the limit of speed. Visitors described him as courteous, even tender, but living in fragments, a mind revisiting the past rather than grasping the present. He sometimes asked to be driven around the old plants, watching the gates open for workers who no longer feared him. "Everything runs," he would murmur half to himself. "That's good. Everything still runs." Outside the mansion, the world was changing beyond recognition. Post-war America embraced consumerism, suburban living, and design innovation, all the things Henry had resisted. Ford II led the company into this new culture, launching cars with color, style, and luxury. The Lincoln Continental became a symbol of American sophistication. Advertising replaced sermons about thrift. Aspiration replaced obedience. For a public emerging from war, cars were no longer tools of progress, they were instruments of joy. Yet the patriarch's shadow lingered. Employees continued to speak of Mr. Ford in the present tense, as though he still occupied every corridor. His portrait hung in offices. His quotations filled company brochures. His ideals taught in training manuals. Even as his doctrines were dismantled, his myth endured the man who had made the modern age possible and who had paid the price for it in solitude. In 1947, on a cold April morning, Henry Ford's long life reached its quiet end. He died in his sleep at Fair Lane, in the same farmhouse where he had been born 83 years earlier. There was no mechanical hum, no ceremony of engines, only the sound of rain against the windows and the River Rouge moving past his property, indifferent and eternal. News of his death traveled across the globe. Newspapers called him the man who put the world on wheels. Presidents sent condolences. Factory whistles blew in unison, pausing production for a single minute of silence, a gesture both reverent and ironic. For a man who once measured existence by efficiency, it was perhaps the most fitting tribute. Time itself stopped, if only briefly. At his funeral, the contrast between myth and man was stark. Thousands gathered outside the Dearborn Chapel, their faces blurred by rain and grief. Inside, family and dignitaries sat beneath a simple wooden cross. No lavish displays, no mechanical fanfare, just silence and the scent of oil and lilies. Clara Ford, veiled and still, held a small white rose. Her grandson, the new Henry, stood beside her, solemn and composed, already bearing the weight of continuity. When the casket was lowered into the earth, a worker from the Rouge whispered, "He gave us everything and took everything with him." It was not bitterness, but truth. Ford's vision had made them part of history, but it had also bound them to a rhythm that would never fully stop. In the years that followed, the company thrived under new leadership. Ford II rebuilt the empire, introduced modern management, and restored public faith. He negotiated with unions the very institutions his grandfather had despised and forged a peace between labor and industry that helped define the post-war economy. The dynasty entered its third generation, learning to balance legacy with evolution. Still, among historians and moralists, the question persisted, how does one measure greatness? By innovation or by empathy? By what a man builds or by what he destroys along the way? Henry Ford's life refused simple judgment. He democratized mobility, yet distrusted diversity. He paid high wages, yet controlled lives. He was a pioneer of progress, yet a prisoner of his own certainty. As the 20th century accelerated, his contradictions became the DNA of modern capitalism itself, the faith in production, the worship of efficiency, the uneasy marriage of moral purpose and mechanical power. The world he built still runs on his principles. Faster, cheaper, everywhere. But behind the gleam of highways and factories, one can still hear the echo of an old question. If a machine can be perfected, can a man? Ford's dynasty continued grandchildren inheriting not just wealth, but a legend. They built museums, funded education, and preserved the name that had once defined America's optimism. Yet no generation escaped the dual inheritance of its founder. Genius and guilt intertwined like gears that cannot disengage. In Fair Lane, after Henry's death, Clara lived quietly for a few years more. She tended the gardens, where tulips grew beside the old path he used to walk. Visitors recalled seeing her stand by the Rouge River, eyes distant, as if listening for the sound of engines in the wind. When she passed, the house became a museum, a shrine to motion, discipline, and contradiction. Henry Ford's empire did not end with his life, but something essential changed. The myth gave way to memory, the machine to meaning. The man who once said, "History is bunk," had become history himself, inescapable, unavoidable, and still running. And as the century moved on, the dynasty faced its greatest task, yet not to conquer the world, but to reckon with the world it had already changed. The hum of the assembly line never truly stopped. It changed pitch, shifted tempo, and evolved with the decades, but its rhythm remained a faint echo of the moment Henry Ford first organized motion into meaning. Long after his death, the Ford empire endured, carried forward by a family learning to live with both the power and the burden of its name. Under Henry Ford II, the company entered its renaissance. The factories became laboratories of innovation, guided by logic rather than paternal command. The whiz kids modernized management. Designers transformed the company's image from austere to aspirational. Cars like the Thunderbird and the Mustang embodied a new generation, bold, youthful, free. They spoke not of duty, but of desire. What had once been the dream of mobility became the language of identity. For the first time, the Ford family stood slightly apart from its creation. They served on boards, oversaw foundations, and pursued philanthropy through the Ford Foundation, which, by mid-century, became one of the most powerful charitable institutions on earth. It funded education, civil rights initiatives, and global development. The wealth born from mechanical order began to nourish social progress. In this way, the dynasty evolved from builders of machines to architects of conscience. Yet the moral question that haunted their patriarch never fully vanished. Could industrial progress truly coexist with human dignity? Each generation faced it anew, whether through environmental scrutiny, labor negotiations, or the ethical dilemmas of globalization. The company adapted, sometimes gracefully, sometimes reluctantly, mirroring the very world Henry Ford helped create. Efficient, ambitious, conflicted. Historians came to see him as both saint and tyrant, the man who gave ordinary people access to the extraordinary, and in doing so, reshaped the measure of human worth. His assembly line became the template for modern production, influencing industries from aviation to electronics. Even the language of progress output, standardization, productivity bore his imprint. But there was another inheritance, quieter yet equally enduring. The reminder that control taken too far erodes compassion. In classrooms and business schools, his story became a parable of paradox, a demonstration that vision without empathy can move the world, but not heal it. At Fair Lane, the old estate remains. The gardens are trimmed. The River Rouge still glides past the windows where he once stood counting minutes. Visitors walk through rooms preserved in amber. The study, the workshop, the wooden clock he built with his own hands. Everything appears orderly, deliberate, complete. Yet in that stillness lies an unmistakable melancholy, as if the house itself remembers that perfection always comes at a cost. For Detroit, the Ford legacy is both monument and mirror. The city rose on the back of the automobile and later crumbled under its own dependence on it. Where once stood the triumphant roar of factories, there are now echoes of reinvention startups, artists, engineers trying to reclaim the spirit of innovation without repeating its mistakes. The story of Ford is the story of America itself, an unending race between creation and conscience. Even now, the company bearing his name continues to adapt electric engines, replacing gasoline, algorithms replacing grease. The assembly line has become digital, but its philosophy remains unmistakably Fordian: simplify, improve, accelerate. The world still runs on his rhythm, even as it questions the price of that rhythm. In museums, children watch grainy footage of the first Model T rolling off the line, unaware that behind the smile of its creator lay exhaustion, fear, and a faith that progress would justify everything. They see the genius. They do not yet see the warning. Perhaps that is as Henry Ford intended, or perhaps it is what every age must rediscover for itself. His name survives not only on cars, but in the architecture of thought. To say Ford is to invoke the dream of motion, the belief that speed can solve. Yet history, relentless as any engine, suggests otherwise, that motion without reflection is merely drift. The Ford family remains one of America's enduring dynasties, not because of power alone, but because of their willingness to evolve beyond it. From Henry's iron certainty to Edsel's quiet artistry, from Clara's steadfast grace to the modern heirs who turned capital into conscience, their journey mirrors the transformation of the nation they helped define. In the end, the machine that changed the world also revealed the world's deepest truth. That invention is never neutral. It shapes not just what we make, but who we become. And so, beneath every hum of traffic, beneath every highway stretching into the horizon, there lingers the faint pulse of that first engine in Dearborn, a reminder of one man's brilliance, his blindness, and the empire built between them. History, like the assembly line, keeps moving. But the question Henry Ford left behind still waits at every turn of the wheel. Not how fast we can go, but whether we know why. Every dynasty leaves behind more than wealth. It leaves a lesson. The Ford family taught the world how to move, but also how easily movement can outrun meaning. If this story moved you, remember history is not just about what they built. It's about what remains when the engines stop. Thank you for watching Legacy of Rich Dynasties. If you'd like to keep exploring the untold truths of power, fortune, and downfall, please subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us next time as we uncover another empire that shaped our world. Until then, stay curious. And remember, every fortune carries a story, and every story carries a warning.